Hello, happy Halloween! Today I'm going to be showing you how to make the Flamethrower and Chestburster from Alien. This can all be done with easily accessible materials and no power tools. To get started, what you're gonna need. To get started, we're gonna need some schematics. There we go. I based my measurements on the bottles I had available to me, but if you want to use my measurements, you can take a screenshot now. I started by tracing my template onto a sheet of dollar store foam core board. I needed 2 cutouts of the main body, 2 of the vent, and 6 of the handles. Next, I cut out 2 long strips of mounting board 2 inches wide. This will be the top and bottom of the main body. I scored the board anywhere I needed it to bend. Then I adhered all these pieces in place with hot glue. I followed the same process for the vent, but I cut the mounting board strip 1/4 of an inch thinner so that it could fit nicely on top of the body. After the main shape was constructed, I filled the hollow inside with blue XPS foam. This will make the flamethrower sturdier and will also give me something to anchor rods to later on. I hot glued the handle cutouts together to create 2 thick identical handles. Then to smooth out the rough edges of the foam board, I used some modeling paste. I tried to make this as smooth as possible, like icing a cake. And like icing a cake, it turned out lumpy as hell. To create the vent texture, I used some drywall mesh. You can get this at any hardware store. I made sure to carefully line up the grid to the bottom edge, then trimmed it to size. The vent in the movie has a lip around it, so I cut that shape out of paperboard. To add detail to the body, I cut out a smaller version of the body template out of mounting board. Then I glued these to either side of the body. I used superglue and baking soda to adhere the handles to the body. The baking soda acts as an accelerator, speeding up the drying time and creating a stronger bond in the process. I stuck wooden dowels through the handles and into the XPS foam on the inside of the body. This makes it less likely for the handles to break off. After the handles were secured, I glued on the vent the same way. The front igniter bit is going to be made from a pill bottle. I put a plastic champagne cork into the opening of the pill bottle. This makes it look like it could shoot fire. Not everyone has such rich, refined tastes. Any piece of plastic will do for this step. Next, I glued some paperboard strips around the pill bottle to look like metal banding. To make the spot where the fuel hose goes in, I found a random piece of junk plastic. I beveled the edges to fit around the curve of the bottle, and then glued a metal washer thing to the end. This gives it a smaller opening for the fuel hose I'll add later on. Then I glued this piece to the pill bottle with more super glue. I got a little carried away and attached all the pieces I was working on yesterday in place. Oops. I attached this front igniter to the rest of the gun with another pill bottle bridged together with these 2 nozzles from lighters. I cut the top off this bottle of isopropyl alcohol and attached that to the back as a tank. All I have left to do is attach these bottom fuel tanks in place, and then it's Greeble time. Before I add a bunch of silly little details, I have to make a silly little attachment for one of the fuel tanks. The details of this won't matter from a distance. The important thing is to find a way to attach the bottle to the body. Since I'm going for speed over accuracy, I built most of this out of robotics toys. I found these at a thrift store. The top section is supposed to look like a valve. I didn't have anything valve-shaped, so I used this cap and a Mega Bloks piece. It may not be perfect, but what is perfect is the way these pieces fit together. Listen. Once connected, I glued that on top, and then I glued the whole thing on top of the bottle. I needed a place to glue the bottle, so I cut out a square of this section of mounting board. If you're following along at home, I recommend you do this earlier, before gluing it in place. I used a dowel again to anchor the 2 pieces, and then attached them together using so much super glue. I recommend wearing a mask for this or you'll get weird headaches. I'm probably fine. Attaching the second fuel tank was much simpler. Even with anchoring and careful gluing, these tanks came loose several times throughout this build. Don't worry if it happens to you, just glue them back together. To make the triggers, I cut 2 pieces of symmetrical plastic I had lying around to the correct length. This could easily be done with any material, though I prefer a flexible plastic as it's less likely to crease. People are going to try pulling the trigger and they are going to break it. Next, it was time to finish the fuel hose. To attach the fuel hose to the igniter, I needed a 90-degree attachment. If you had a broken pair of headphones or an old patch cord lying around, that would work perfectly, but unfortunately I did not, so I used a metal bit I found on the ground, connected to 2 megablock cylinders. I carved a hole out of the center of the vent, and then capped it off with a round piece of plastic. Then I went to attach the 2 pieces together, and well, I saw that coming. On my second attempt, I simply attached the hose to the vent first. This worked much better. With that, the main structures are done, and that means it's Greeble time. If you're unfamiliar with Greebling, it means adding bits for detailing. It originally referred to parts from model kits, but I mostly use garbage. I started the Greebling process with this rubber tube I found on the street. An absolutely choice find. I cut it in half to fit snugly onto the Flamethrower body, and then I extended the tube with a bisected superglue container. Then I capped off both ends with circular bits. Once those were glued in, I added 2 small batteries to look like buttons. This red plastic piece came from a sharps container, and the plastic ring came from a sauce bottle. I am quickly making my way through these pieces I salvaged from a broken laundry hamper. They make for great square details. And speaking of squares, it's time to talk about this video's sponsor, The Street. The Street was kind enough to supply me with bits for this project, including this little guy. The laundry hamper was looking a bit boring, so I added some rhinestone rivets to it. I used some of these metal things in my last sci-fi build. If you know what these are, please leave a comment. I trimmed them to size and then glued them in place here. I kept my references close by to get inspiration on what bits should go where. This is an old headphone cord capped off with superglue stoppers. Time to flip! I also found these cool rubber pieces on the street. They add an excellent geometric detail. Next, I started adding what I assume is a scope. Not sure why you need a scope on a flamethrower, but it certainly looks cool. I attached the end of a lighter to an empty pen casing, then attached a plastic tube to a couple more plastic bits, capped with a robotics piece. I joined those 2 sections with a piece from a moisturizer pump. With the scope done, I moved onto the piece underneath the scope. For this, I carefully bisected a tank from a dollar store water gun. This plastic is really flimsy, so you have to be super careful. I cracked open that sweet egg, and then capped it off with a round bit. Then I glued both those pieces in place. This is a bit from the inside of a lighter. Then I added some microchips and metal plates that I found throughout. To figure out where I wanted things to go, I placed them and rearranged them until I found a configuration that I liked. I glued in these parts from pens to look kind of like tubing, and then capped them off with more superglue stoppers. Then I added a zip tie and capped that off with metal bits from microchips. And with that, it's ready to paint. Let's add some heat to this bad boy. I started with a red spray paint for the fuel tank, taping off the rest to prevent any bleeding. Once it was dry, I got to do the least satisfying tape pull you've ever seen. Then I moved on to the igniter. I sprayed this first with black, and then with silver. With that, the base coat is done and I can start painting. White is deceptively hard to paint. to make something look like an old sci-fi prop, you have to be very selective with your use of grays and absolutely weather the crap out of it. I started by covering the entire thing in a wash of brown and black acrylic paint. I went into every nook and cranny, started wiping away until the whole thing looked nice and dirty. Occasionally I would reference screenshots to see where the grime was most prominent. Next, to break up the white areas, I painted the handles a light gray. I also took this time to paint any areas that are going to be metallic a medium gray. While I let that dry, I channeled my inner Bill making stuff and started adding rust to the metal. To do this, I used a variety of oranges and browns, making sure to leave some metallic areas peeking through. After it was looking nice and rusty, I went back in with the metallic paint on the edges and anywhere else I thought rust might easily scrape away. I used the same methods for the fuel tank attacher and the fuel tank itself, making it look like the paint was chipped and worn. Then I went back in with a second round of more intentional weathering. I added boulder grime where I thought it would get dirtiest, and I added white back to any areas that got too dirty. Finally, I gave all the metal bits a metallic dry brush. This makes any areas I painted gray look metallic and brings back some of the surface details. With that, the flamethrower is complete, but this is a two-part build. What is a flamethrower without something to scorch? I made a very quick Chestburster puppet as part of this build. Let's get started on that. To start, I needed to make a base for the puppet. Since this is an at-home DIY, I used the most at-home materials I could find, duct tape and rubber gloves. I taped around the glove until I had roughly a puppet shape. Then I bulked out the head using tinfoil. I formed the tinfoil into a round shape and then taped it to the glove. I did this for the lower jaw as well, until it looked roughly xenomorph shaped. Next, I busted out some old school model magic. This is an air dry clay for children. It's spongy, hard to work with, and really only sticks to itself, but it's a little flexible so it won't crack so easily. This means we don't have to do any mold making, and since it'll be covered in blood, I figured I could sacrifice a little bit of detail for ease here. So I rolled out some clay and began adding it to the tinfoil structure. It took a little practice, but I got used to the clay after a while. With the first layer applied, it was really starting to look like a beluga whale. So I added the big round unopened eyes and the weird wrinkle details. Then using some water, I smoothed out the shapes. I let that dry overnight and I was left with this. There were a few cracks, but I filled those with super glue and baking soda, good as new. But it was still looking a little too cute, so I started working on the teeth. I didn't want to sculpt and bake a bunch of teeth out of Sculpey, so I instead opted for the simpler solution, using the ends of toothpicks. I cut those to size, stuck them into the slightly soft clay, and then secured them with more superglue and baking soda. It was at this stage I started to wonder how I was going to paint this. You can't paint tinfoil. But you can paint rubber. So, to cover up the tinfoil parts, I cut up the other rubber glove, creating a weird skin bib. Then I attached that in place using hot glue. With all those pieces fully in place, I let the model magic fully cure overnight. Unfortunately, the back of the skull cracked a lot and I realized this section wasn't going to work. I needed it to be a little more flexible, so I took a little creative liberty and turned the solid skull into an overlapping carapace. This gave me the flexibility I needed while also keeping the essence of the original xenomorph. But with that problem solved, I was ready to start painting. Again, I knew I was going to cover this thing in blood, so I went for a very simple paint job. I did a base coat of a yellowy tan over the whole puppet. Off camera, I gave the whole thing a second coat of yellowy tan, this time mixed with glossy Mod Podge. This will make the whole thing shinier and more skin-like. I then mixed up my own fake blood concoction. This was made up of paint, glossy Mod Podge, pouring medium, and red ink. I had no idea if this was going to work. I then started adding this mixture to the puppet. Through some experimentation, I found that adding a little water to my brush made the blood flow more realistically. I used this to create natural pools and streams of blood using movie screenshots as reference. This turned out grosser than I could have imagined. It is horrible to look at. I love it. To finish it off, I painted the inside of the mouth a darker shade of tan, then painted the teeth an off-white color. And with that, it's all done and on to the glamour shots. This was an incredibly fun project to work on, a little different than my usual stuff. If you like my videos, or you want to see me make another prop making video, please consider subscribing. This video marks my 1-year anniversary on YouTube, and I'm really close to hitting 1,000 subscribers. As always, let me know what you'd like to see me make next time. Bye!